And astronomers actually do very well there because we're used to dealing with messy, noisy data sets. We're used to dealing with basically not being able to do controlled experiments. We're used to like the kind of good kinds of inference where it's this very complex system and you can only observe maybe a few of the things about it. So they've had good luck with astronomers.
Welcome to the Astronomers Turned Data Scientists podcast. I'm Joseph Ahern, and I've been a data scientist for almost 2 years.
And I'm Jeff Silverman, another host of the ATDS podcast, and I've been a data scientist for a bit over 7 years now. And our guest today is Betsy Barton. Welcome, Betsy.
Thanks.
So we usually like to start these off with sort of just a little bit of a history of yourself, a little bio of sort of what you did in astro and physics research land, how you made the transition, or at least a short bit about that. We'll probably dig in more later, and then sort of what you're doing these days in the world of big data and tech.
Sure. So I was an extragalactic astronomer. At the end of my career in astronomy, I was a professor at UC Irvine. I worked on both galaxy interactions and on high redshift galaxies, mostly as an observer. And I also spent a lot of time working on big telescope, like TMT for the most part at that point, type of projects. And I was on the science advisory committee and the Gemini board and various other things. So yeah, I was involved, extragalactic observer. So I left astronomy in 2011. So the way it happened, it's a kind of a complicated and strange story, but I had my old office mate from grad school had been at this hedge fund Renaissance for more than 10 years since we had left grad school. And he kept telling me about it. And I understood it was a kind of a unique place. And I finally went and interviewed there and liked it and decided to make the jump. So unlike most people that I encounter now who are leaving the field, I really didn't consider other jobs in data science. So I stayed there for 7.5 years, and it's very academic style. So it was much closer to academia than everything I've done subsequently. When I left there in 2019, that's right, yes, I spent a year leading a data science team for Walmart. So it was actually a startup company that had been purchased by Walmart, and I wanted to learn about corporate data science and also startup culture at the same time. So it was a great opportunity. But I ended up heading their data science team, and I learned a lot from the folks that work with me. And I spent a year commuting from pretty far out on Long Island to Brooklyn 3 times a week. That was a pretty crazy year. After that, I left and started my own company. It's called Infiniscape. And what we've been doing has taken on several different forms, but right now we have a social media app called Kyndr, and we're still working pretty hard on understanding the best way to deploy. So it's in a quiet beta right now. There are some people on it, but we haven't had a big public launch because we're still trying to understand exactly what to do. Mostly because the current social media, this current way that social media's economic model operates, I think is very damaging. And so I think that's the thing that has to be tackled. And the ideas that we've had for tackling it, we have to get it right or it's not gonna be great, right? So we have been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of talking to people, and a lot of planning for what to do. We have some other products too that are in development that are more B2B, more like building for other businesses to use AI, but those are in early stages as well.
Well, I think I had heard of Renaissance Technologies. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
From a book I was reading, like The Physics of Wall Street. If I remember correctly, they have something to do with investing and gaining like a very large percentage each year, more than what's expected or more than what other companies are able to get. And so I'm wondering if like how with your background in astrophysics, like if how that makes a difference at a sort of company like Renaissance Technologies.
So Renaissance is like a very rigorous giant model of the stock market and futures markets. They're relatively secretive about what they do, but they're quite open about the fact that they hire mathematicians, computer scientists, physicists, sometimes engineers, and astronomers. And that's most of who they hire into their research groups. And nowadays, I think everyone they hire probably has a PhD, and many of them have postdoc experience or beyond. So it's really, they hire people knowing they don't have finance experience, but there's a sort of internal language that's very mathematical at Renaissance, and they expect it to take a long time for people to come up to speed. But it's really sort of like a rigorous data science, statistics and math and programming problem. And astronomers actually do very well there because we're used to dealing with messy, noisy data sets. We're used to dealing with basically not being able to do controlled experiments. We're used to like the kind of good kinds of inference where it's this very complex system and you can only observe maybe a few of the things about it. So they've had good luck with astronomers, but everyone they hire is in the same boat of, into the research group is in the same boat of not really knowing finance.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, your experience jumping into, not having a finance background, jumping into a finance position, but one that, could leverage that skill set. I think that's a, pretty good example of what a lot of, I hear from astro and physics academics of, well, I don't know about TV analytics or shipping or whatever, companies people might jump into, and people being worried about that. So yeah, I'd love to hear I know kind of parts of your answer, but I'd love to hear your experience there.
Yeah, none of that matters as long as you have enough time to come up
Right.
to speed on this. So if they're hiring you, expecting you to do something great for them tomorrow, then you have to be cautious. But if they know that it's going to take you time to come up to speed, but then when you're up to speed, you're going to be very helpful, then it's fine, right? It really isn't. And to be honest, like I would occasionally accidentally refer to things as galaxies. And it really is the same. I mean, I was pretty, I liked statistics. I liked to do things that were, noisy, but statistically based. And so it was good. It was an easy transition, honestly, partly because they're used to people coming in and making that transition. Honestly, one of the harder things about that was by the time I was, 7 years into being a professor, I didn't touch data all that much myself and code. And my grad students were certainly better coders than I was. And so you go from that to really sitting in front of the code almost all day. That was a hard transition. And also not traveling for work. That was a hard transition. But coming up to speed, I mean, it took a lot of energy and thought, and I had to listen carefully, and you have to be able to accept starting over. But in terms of just being able to do the work, didn't seem problematic. And then I started over again when I left Renaissance, in essence. And, that might be the last time. It gets harder when the neurons are less elastic.
So at Renaissance, you were an individual contributor,
Mhm.
I take it, and then on the Walmart team, you were the manager of the team. So
Mhm.
that's when you made that transition from IC, individual contributor, to manager. What was that like for you?
Well, as a professor, I was managing grad students and classes and teams. It was different, but it wasn't completely foreign. That transition was difficult, but I hired an amazing executive coach who coached me through it directly. Just like straight up, okay, here's how you onboard somebody. Here's what you ask in a one-to-one. Here's how often you have them. Here's what your job really is. Here's what you need to be thinking about. Just all of it, right? Otherwise, it would have not worked out anyway as well as it did. Yeah, that was a strange transition. And I did, the year that I was at Walmart, I did learn Python. I didn't know it at all. And I don't know it as well as people who have been sitting there working with it for 10 years or something, but I probably use it a little bit like I use R, but I know it well enough to be dangerous.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about the, executive coach. I feel like I've heard a few friends of mine in data science that were former academics have gotten them at various points in their career. And I think they seem mostly happy with results and what they've got out of that kind of experience. But at least on the podcast so far, we haven't really talked about that kind of topic. So I'd love to hear, how you found yours, how you found the back and forth with them, and what kind of folks do you think would benefit from that? Somebody coming right out of academia, is that a bit early in their career for some kind of executive coach, or are there certain folks that are good at that kind of advice, or is it a little bit more late stage? I honestly don't know. I don't have too much personal experience with this kind of thing.
So I don't know that much about early stage executive coaching. I know it exists because my coach has like groups that she'll coach who are more junior than the individual clients she has. So I didn't know what one was when I was most of the time at Renaissance. It's certainly not in academia. But Dave Silva, who was former director of Noir Lab, or I guess it was NOAO back then. But anyway, I came to AAS, after 6 years of Renaissance or whatever, and it was very helpful because there's all these people that I knew who I trusted to give me advice. And he just was like, you need an executive coach. Because I was telling him about the experience with recruiters, and that, it's totally different. Recruiters are very helpful, but they're not primarily looking out for you. They're primarily trying to put you into a job. And that's not true of every recruiter, but on average, that's the case. And so he said, what you need is an executive coach and you need a woman. And I was like, okay. So then I had gone, I can't remember, it was probably a LinkedIn page. I'd gone to a conference called Tech Up for Women, but there are a lot of similar things like that. And so I just called the first name that showed up in one of the forums on the LinkedIn and got very lucky. Very, very lucky. So yeah, I found my coach's name is Dana Mahina. Now she's changed it. And she is extremely focused on the work-life harmony, she calls it, which is like figuring out, work-life balance. It's along the lines of what we think of as work-life balance, but there's no such thing as balance. You can't do all of one thing and all of the other at the same time. So it's about making conscious trade-offs, and that's been enormously helpful for me. I have a somewhat chaotic life. So yeah, but a lot of other things that she was able to teach me. She's a former CEO and president of a company, and she's been involved in a lot of like mergers and acquisitions and things like that. And she left corporate maybe not too many years before I showed up, and was coaching full time, and she's not like on a lot of boards and coaching. So I think for a more junior person, I think you have to think a little bit about what your goals are. But I do think coaching can be expensive. But I think the act of explicitly thinking, what are my goals? And especially, what are my strengths? What do I actually like to spend my time doing? Because, I think most people probably end up in individual contributor roles when they start in data science, unless they're very senior when they leave astronomy. And so, but there's different tracks that you follow from there, right? As we've talked about at ATDS many times. And so if you don't know what track you're interested in, then I definitely recommend finding someone that can, even if it's just a friend to help in a coaching role, because the act of explicitly trying to figure out what you want to do is very important. It's very helpful in terms of not just being buffeted by sort of what comes along.
Right. And then just a year after you started that role, you decided to start your own company. Can you tell us more about what the background on that? Like, had you been thinking about doing that for a while and then you just decided it was time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I would have, if I had thought I understood tech at all, I would have started the company straight out of the hedge fund. However, I was fully aware that the hedge fund is very insular and very academic in its style. And, I was right. There's a lot of tools and modern techniques and modern problems that I just wasn't particularly aware of. So, I sort of knew the theory, but not much about the practice of modern data science. There was also a part of me that wondered explicitly whether I would be interested in corporate. And I'll tell you, if you're thinking about that, Walmart's not the company to go to, because it is so huge that it's very, very hard to get any sense of what they actually do. because there's all these different parts of Walmart and they don't know what each other's doing. And you just land in one of them and then it's very strange. But I would say still, I was confident in saying, I don't want to work my way up inside a big company at that point. And then the startup, I got to see what the startup was like. It went from, when I was there for just a little over a year, it went from being about 30 people to being, pretty much not exactly a division of Walmart, but like 150 people, that were sort of part of Walmart in a separate office, but being sort of subsumed into different parts of Walmart. So it wasn't a straight up like normal startup experience, but I at least got to like experience the culture of because the people who started this company were the guy who started was a serial entrepreneur, is a serial entrepreneur. So that was very helpful. And also, I don't think I even realized until I went to Walmart that I did not know much about modern software engineering. So vitally important, obviously, to know something about that if you're going to start a tech company. Yeah, so it was an intentional learning experience. I thought there might have been a chance I would have wanted to stay, but it became clear that that wasn't the case for a little while.
I think, one of the things that we hear, or I hear, people asking questions about, what type of company do people want to work at? Big, giant, well-established companies like Walmart, big, giant tech companies like your Apples and your Googles, startups, mid-sized companies, it's kind of all over the place. And, there's pros and cons to all of them, and there's different styles, right? I think reading a bit between the lines, Betsy, you learned a lot from a big established company of how to do modern software, but maybe, once you kind of learned a little bit of it, you weren't, didn't want to be kind of in that, in a strict mold, let's say, in that. Whereas I have friends that like working at those big companies because there is the strict processes in place and they can follow the steps and they get their stuff done, and that's a certain working style. And then there's other people that kind of want to, build their own thing, and that's a different working style. So, I like pointing out all those differences of, because when people are looking for jobs, they're just like data science in the title, that's it. And it's like, okay, but what size of company, what location of company, what type of field, right? All those many axes that you can look at and think about, and comparing and contrasting those. And I think another thing that, you're a great example of is trying those different things, right? Like, I don't know, maybe I do want to work at a really big, well-established company, and maybe there's some pros and cons, and I don't know. So you try it for a year or something, and then you choose to switch. That's very common. That's not something that's common in academia. You kind of get locked into your job. You hope you can hold it for a few years, and then you have to go somewhere else. And, of course, there are layoffs and, companies go under in tech as well, of course, but there's also a lot of optional, moving between companies and moving to different types of companies. So, I'll use that as a segue to Infiniscape and where you are now, and, tell us a little bit about sort of what you're up to currently. And I think we'll probably spin that off into AI, because I know you have thoughts, and we've had a good talk from you at ATDS earlier this year about that stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So there's a few different things that we're doing. We have the Kyndr platform, which was built, like, I have an engineering team that built that for the most part, and a product manager who's amazing. And then we're doing some sort of one-off data science projects. One of the ones that I am excited about is actually using ChatGPT pretty straightforwardly, but to evaluate focus group data in a qualitative way. And it's not even trying to turn qualitative into quantitative as much as it's trying to find highlights in qualitative data. We're actually working directly with a marketing firm that wants this tool, which is great. It's the best way, I think, to develop products. And they're extremely thoughtful firm. So that's been a great experience. It's unfortunate that in the prototyping stage right now, it's up until like a week and a half ago, it was just me coding it. And I love doing that, but the folks I'm hiring are going to have to clean it up. So, but it's a good, like, you can test and prototype something and see whether it's going to work pretty cleanly in this type of. And so I actually, I was just talking to somebody about this the other day, but the advice that I was seeing for a very long time on like TechCrunch or to startup companies looking for venture capital was, oh, we're not going to value you highly unless you're training your own models. But I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for using these models in the right way, right? not in the like throw it all in and see what it spits out, but in the like figure out what kinds of questions you can get accurate and consistent answers to, and then figure out how to use those things to do something, for example, in a business context, but it really could be in any context. Another product that we're developing that isn't being developed by me, but I have a data scientist working with me, is a tool using ChatGPT to just examine people's social media, like social media influencers who want to know like what works well, what type of followers do I have, who are my most consistent followers, have they been around for a long time? So it's like a mix of, you know, straight data science that Python can just do, right? Once you have the data, and things that you could do by just making simple calls to ChatGPT. I mean, it could be any of these large language models, obviously, but we've been working with ChatGPT because we haven't seen the end of what it can do yet. So I actually think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in just using simple calls to ChatGPT in clever ways, if that makes sense. I would love to hear your perspective too, if you want to jump in. I don't know if you guys think about products, AI products very much, but yeah, but I do. It's fun.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo, I think, the fact that there's a huge amount of room and quite a bit of low-hanging fruit on just sort of using what already exists, or, you know, maybe some slight tweaking or, you know, niche training of a model. But, you know, there are groups out there that are trying to, you know, do stronger, better, faster, you know, models from the ground up, and that's great. That's a very small percentage of, I think, what data folks are going to be using, you know, any kind of large AI model for. But something that I've heard from a lot of folks, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Betsy, is, you know, a lot of data science jobs may involve some step of prompt engineering. So, you know, you've got some language model and it's maybe just out of the box from ChatGPT or one of these other places, or maybe it's been tweaked by some other type of engineer specifically for financial stuff or specifically for sentiment analysis, like you're kind of talking about. But then, you know, where a data scientist might jump in is prompt engineering, of trying to get that right prompt, to get the right answer, or to get the most complete and accurate answer out of one of these models, and then run with that from there, whether it's, you know, code or data or something like that. So I'm curious to hear, you know, where you guys have experienced, you know, that sort of side of the AI revolution, the current AI revolution, I guess.
I mean, prompt engineering is the development of this latest tool that I was mentioning. It's all prompt engineering.
Oh, yeah.
It's knowing how to write the prompt to give you data that you can then use to do other things that you might be able to then infer something with and turn around and craft a different prompt. So yes, prompt engineering is big. I think it's very important. And, you know, it's one of these things where, like, if you're very mathy, it's more like an art form. So it's disconcerting because I'm sure, like, I haven't optimized this in any way, right? But it's kind of interesting in terms of, like, I was very, very surprised at how well you can ask it to analyze like something like a focus group transcript and it'll give you accurate, if you ask it the right set of questions, it'll give you accurate stuff that would take a person a while to figure out. So yeah, there's just a lot of stuff like that, you know, maybe people are figuring out, but the whole like start to finish turning it into a product that people can use for a time. Yeah, I think there's a lot of space for that right now. It's not going to get you $100 million of VC money, but it could get you a product that sells pretty well.
Yeah, one of those phrases you used was for a product that can work for a time. And so that's one of the things I've been thinking about is, one is developing something fast enough that you can launch it before something else already exceeds that capability. And so then it's like, well, all that work I did was wasted, sort of. The other one is that there are probably other people who are trying to develop something faster than anyone else. And so I might not be the first person. Maybe I'm the 15th person to develop a product that does a certain functionality. And so earlier you had mentioned thinking of clever ways to use that. And so I think if what you decide on your product is clever enough, is like niche enough, then that can work really well. But it's also going to have its own timeline. Like hopefully it's a year or more so that you can get something out of it, and ideally it doesn't have a short lifespan but a long one. And you don't really know that going in. How do you weigh these thoughts when you're determining which sort of product to pursue?
Well, look, in the early days of my company, it was also a learning experience for me. So I can't say that I think I understand what I'm doing better than I did then. The advice, I'll back up a little bit. The advice that you always, and you may know this, but the big advice from serial entrepreneurs is to test, right? To develop your product quickly, test it, and get rid of it if it doesn't work, right? And in the context of our social media app, that wasn't plausible, right? So, but in the context of products like this, I think it is. I think my thinking now, and I'm like, for example, I'm loving the fact that we are working like lockstep with a marketing firm that wants to use this tool that we're developing, right? And to me, and they did a market search for competition for what other tools exist, and which, at this exact moment, or at least as of a month ago, there wasn't anything that was really comparable to what we were trying to do. So I think the more we can get towards sort of rapid development of these tools, and having like the infrastructure in place to develop maybe even several of them, and then take them through testing phase, and where you have a few handfuls of customers, and then if it looks big, then doing significant software engineering to get it to scale, that kind of pipeline. And also keeping in mind that you're going to have to keep like making changes to the product as things change, and keeping in mind that somebody might invent something tomorrow that makes it completely obsolete, right? Like if you can develop in that environment, then for a time you're going to be doing well. And so if you look at like the Microsoft's Copilot, which apparently has not been all that, it's too general purpose, right? Eventually they're going to figure out how to build it in a way that still works for the set of purposes that people try to use it for. And then things I'm doing aren't going to be big sellers anymore, right? So it's a finite amount of time. All these things are changing super rapidly. So I think learning to develop products, am I answering your question? I think learning to develop products in that environment is the key right now. And I think, the one I love talking about all the time, even though I haven't worked in it, is robotics, which, in my opinion, about to, as soon as they get a general set of capabilities for robots, and I'm not a big fan of the humanoid robots, but we'll see. I could be wrong. They're very expensive. But I think once they get a suite of cheap robots that can do various things, then it's like open season, right? It's a data science problem. It's okay, how do I put together these strings of tasks to do anything that someone wants to do in manufacturing or in any other thing that involves manipulating items, right? So I think that's going to come sooner rather than later, and it's a data science problem. But like everything else, it's going to evolve incredibly rapidly. So I think I sort of think of it, I'm not, in very early stages of thinking about this, but I sort of think of it as what platforms, like, or protocols do we need in place, almost. Not even like data platform, because those things will be obsolete unless you build them really, really cleverly, which I can't even fathom. But protocols for transferring information. So like this person wants to make this thing and they have a certain amount of domain knowledge about it, but they don't have, a factory that makes it, but can they transfer the right set of information to a general purpose factory that knows how to take that information, maybe simulate something with it, have a few people evaluate that simulation, and then push go, right? That kind of thing. So all of that fascinates me. I know it's a rapidly changing environment, and I think it's going to be exciting, data science, for a long time.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of, videos recently. I forget which companies, but they've got like a robot that's like 4 wheels and an arm, and they just stick it in front of a door and say, figure out how to open this door. and like it fiddles around and then eventually opens the door. They stick it in front of a different door with a different type of knob, and like it gets faster, and it's like learning how to open doors. And I'm like, this is very Jurassic Park, Velociraptors, but I like where it's going. Kind of
Oh,
cool.
yeah. Yeah. No, and then it really is not a traditional robotics problem, right?
Yeah.
When you get to a certain level with that, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's going to change a lot of stuff, but I'm not sure when.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I want to switch gears a little bit and, thinking about folks coming from academia, various levels of physics or astro background, looking for jobs in tech and data science, thinking about your experience hiring, interviewing, working with those recruiters that you referred to earlier, just sort of what are the things that you look for in those kinds of candidates for, certain roles coming, straight out of academia. How, what skills can they bring, how should they tweak their resume, right? I think there's a lot of agreement among people that we talk to through ATDS about this, but everybody's got their sort of certain spin on it, the things that they look for and think are really really useful above and beyond sort of maybe people with data science master's degrees or people who have been a software engineer in tech for a while, right? What distinguishes people that you want to hire that are coming from that physics astro academia?
I always find this question hard to ask because I don't feel like I have a fantastic answer to it. I feel like there's a ton of randomness in the hiring process. And I feel like I usually am drawn to people who have like a vision that's similar to mine in reality. I will say, for example, when I did the most interviewing at Walmart, well, that's not true. I did the most interviewing in a sense that you're asking about at Walmart. And the thing that I always looked for was, you get tons and tons of resumes where people have a big list of projects that they've done, right? And you don't even if they're straight from academia, you don't know what their background was really like, right? And so what I used to like to do is pick one or two of them and just ask them in some detail, like, what did you actually do in here, right? What, if you're fitting a model, X versus Y, what is X, what is Y, what are the detailed considerations that you had to consider, right? Because I think the thing that I am afraid of is people who just like to run model after model after model and don't understand, people who aren't going to check and make sure what they're doing makes sense. People who aren't going to understand, you want to avoid that, right? You want people who understand it thoroughly. I do, more than people who know a lot of fancy techniques. I don't know that that's really the general attitude, so I don't know how helpful that is, in the question that you're asking. But in terms of resumes, you definitely do want a list. You don't want a giant laundry list. You want maybe a small laundry list and some more detailed description of what you actually did in a few contexts. That makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, when I look at resumes, I feel like I see a lot that are just long laundry lists. And yeah, that shorter one with much more detail, I think is much more interesting. I think another way that I phrased it to people is, if you put something on your resume, you should be prepared to talk about it in detail and know what the heck, right? If you just write a bullet point of like, I was on this awesome thing that observed a bunch of galaxies, and I ask you about it, and you're like, oh yeah, I think I reduced some data or something, like that's not good, right? You should be able to talk in depth, like you said, what is the X, what is the Y, what are the considerations? And so it's much better to put fewer projects but describe them more in depth and be able to talk about them more in depth and hopefully be excited about them, right? Like you want to show some excitement and positivity too. I think that always is nice in an interview.
And I wouldn't say you don't want to omit the laundry list of skills in case someone is looking, is looking to just see oh, I've done this before, but yeah, right. Like having done something start to finish in depth by far trumps a big laundry list.
I'd like to hear a little bit about Kyndr, the app, and what your vision is for that, and how you've gone about developing it so far up to this point as well.
So we didn't start Infiniscape in order to develop a social media app, actually. So what I wanted to develop in 2020, in February of 2020, was something I refer to as the dome. And it's still in my head, and I want to do it someday. But I was thinking about immersive event centers for people that were, a lot of stuff exists that's like very expensive, one-off immersive experience. But I think that there's room for something more like a movie theater that's an immersive experience for people to go. So you could feel like you're like eating dinner in Paris, or, just to make you feel like you're somewhere else, right? There's been a lot of developments in projection and of course in software, and now generative, generative imagery that could do a lot. So that was what was in my head. But of course the pandemic hit, and it's good for me in the sense that the thing that I wanted to do, I didn't realize, but would have been way more capital intensive than what I was preparing for. And I realize that now. And so it's good that I didn't do that. But we thought at the time that we would try to do an online version of that. So the first product we tried to present was essentially Zoom meetings for people to get to meet each other and go through experiences that would like allow them to get to know each other or talk about interesting things, or, just trying to get people to connect using new techniques, right? And that did not work. We were able to develop some interesting experiences, but people who did them would come, they would like them, and they would not come back, right? It was too much of a barrier to get on a Zoom meeting with a bunch of strangers. So after that, we thought for a while and decided we would develop an app that had, lower barrier, something people are accustomed to doing. And the thing that we, after maybe 6 or 8 months of this, came around to was basically a management training app. And so we were developing Kyndr. It wasn't called that. It was just called Infiniscape at that time. We developed it with pretty broad capabilities at that time. And then just as we were on the verge of like finally defining what the MVP was going to be, Elon bought Twitter. And we thought, okay, I guess we should just do what we really want to do, which is build a consumer product. And so then we started to build the app. And I think we changed the vision for it a few times. And so it took a little bit longer than expected. But right now it is a fairly full service social media app, which doesn't have a lot of people on it. As I mentioned, we haven't done a serious public launch or anything like that. It is community focused, and it has some fairly innovative community features for, we've talked to a lot of creators and influencers who, especially, I think we gravitate toward people who are on an app that's designed for a one-to-many type of environment, but would actually rather have genuine community with their followers. And so we've been building tools along those lines. But the number one thing we want to do is not monetize with in-feed advertising. And so we have some vision for that now that I can't really talk about, but it's a pretty big pivot. When it happens, I will make sure you know. But yeah, I think that we've come to the realization that it's the economic model, right? That when Meta boosts posts because a lot of people are paying attention to them, that's a problem, because a lot of things that people, I'm sure you know all this, right? A lot of things that people pay attention to are negative, right? It's not what you want to see, it's what you can't turn away from, right? And that's the problem. And that, I think, is the addiction and all of the misinformation and all of the negative things that happen follow from that. So Kyndr, quiet that it is right now, it still has a small community on it. And we have everybody sign a pledge with certain types of behavior. We are heavy-handed with moderation. And I will say, people still put stuff on there that just people are sometimes unbelievable in what they're willing to do. But yeah, we have automated moderation tools. We pull stuff off. We're doing our best, and obviously we're going to get better with time. So we're keeping it very heavily moderated. We're keeping it as positive as possible. We are curating. Anyone that has a community on there is someone that we've set it up, right? You can't automatically create. You have to become a creator on the app, someone who's able to build a community. We have to approve you essentially and know what you're planning to do. So it's things like that where we want to build something more positive from the ground up.
So perhaps you can't talk about this, but I'll take a swing and see if you have comments. But we talked about, you just mentioned, a lot of moderation and stuff that goes into this. We also talked about Gen AI and large language models. So thinking about marrying the two, using, an AI bot to do all of that kind of checking and moderating for you.
I want to. I think it's probably too expensive at this moment, but yes, thinking about that. Yeah, one of the early thoughts that we had about how to monetize Kyndr was generating training data for people having people label things with a broader set of emotional labels that are, broader than just good or bad or like or dislike, but like, I find this encouraging. I find this condescending, right? That kind of thing. But that's a nice example of ChatGPT could just do it. Anything that we would have built, it's just better. So, good thing that we didn't go too far down that path. But that's the environment that we live in. So yes, I do think about that a lot, but it has to be affordable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've definitely heard of many different situations of people running into, either if it's whether it's just number of calls or cost per call or things like that with these kinds of systems. And so, I've started to see people writing papers and talking about, well, I've got a lightweight version that you can just run locally on your laptop and you just download it, or open source flavors, right? I work at Mozilla. We like supporting open source projects around this kind of stuff. So that's another possible avenue that I've seen, just in the last, I'd say, few weeks, starting to get a bit of traction. So that's very cool.
Oh, great. Yeah. Can you send
Hopefully,
that to me?
so yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
I will happily share some stuff that we've been chatting about, not being developed at Mozilla, but of course, any cool open source project that pops up is on our radar, and we like supporting those folks.
That's
But
cool.
yeah, so hopefully that continues to make these things more usable in more use cases, and not having to rely on self-funding, right? Or like funding itself, right? You can only use it if you can monetize it, right? Almost, unfortunately. So we're getting toward the end of our hour or so here. So I just wanted to ask Betsy if there was any other topic, question that you wanted us to probe at that we didn't get to, or other comments you wanted to leave us with here.
I think we covered a lot of it. I don't know if I came in with any kind of list. I guess this gets addressed a lot in the astronomy to data science context, but there's a sort of an emotional toll, or what would you say, like a barrier to leaving academia after you've gone down it a long way. And I would like to know, I've heard you say this before, but I would like to hear you say it again. How do you feel about that barrier? What is your view of that? Like, sort of, once you've made it to a certain place in academia, you're heavily socialized to see the positives of academia, and it's hard, right? Like for example, when I was leaving, I would wake up in the middle of the night being like, oh my God, what am I doing? Right. Sometimes like, and after I left, that didn't happen. Right. So Jeff, what's your take on that? I would love to hear it.
I want to point out that of the, I don't know what number episode this is, 5, maybe something like that, maybe 6. This is the most questions that we've gotten from the interviewee. So this is awesome. I like that. Yeah, there's definitely, I think a lot of it is sort of a sunk cost mentality, or sunk cost, maybe not quite fallacy, but like I've spent my however many years and good active young years of my life, 20s, 30s, doing this career, and now I'm going to completely change that, right? I think that is hugely scary, I think, for anybody. Yeah, even folks that I know who had relatively negative experiences throughout grad school, postdoc, in academia, are still like, yeah, but I don't know anything else, right? Just that change can be very intimidating and scary. Some people, many people I know think is a hugely positive change, and in many, many ways. Not everyone, but there is that. The other thing that I like to always mention, and I know both Betsy and Joseph have heard this before from me, of I still like astronomy. I still have astro pictures as my Zoom background. I usually change it out every couple weeks, and like people at work ask me about it, and I'm like, oh, this is an exploding star. It went off in 1987 in a nearby galaxy, and it's sort of like what I used to study is exploding stars. I still, I volunteer at a local space and science center and, help run their telescopes. I go to AAS through ATDS, which is very fun. And I still go to, astronomy talks while I'm there. I still occasionally read archive papers when I have friends post something, about, supernovae, which I used to work on. And so I still feel certainly connected to astronomy research that way, even though I'm not doing it full time. I'm not doing it during the workday. I'm, doing it occasionally in, and certainly not doing any research myself, but, following along and reading pop science articles, et cetera. So that I think was a big thing that I was worried about, was like, oh, I'm going to like suddenly forget about stellar evolution. And it's like, no, I don't quite remember, which neutrinos are produced in the PP chain, which I did at least know for like my quals or whatever. But like, I still know the stages of stellar evolution, and I can still read a paper about or see a pop science article about landing something on the moon and understanding like, oh yeah, that's hard. And oh, something can, if you're going to land it on the moon, you have a couple weeks of light and then you have a couple weeks of dark, because that's how moon phases work. And if you can't store enough energy for a couple weeks, you're done. You got 2 weeks to hang out on the moon, right? I was just reading about that earlier today. And so I still feel connected to that knowledge base and can still learn more about that knowledge base without actively participating in research or doing that for a career. And that makes me really happy. And I think assuaged a lot of that concern of like, I'm just not going to do astronomy anymore.
Yeah. So what do you miss? I can answer that for myself. I miss
Yeah.
people. Yeah. I miss the fact that there's this huge community that's almost endless in that sense. But what do you miss the most?
I liked going to telescopes and staying up all night and traveling. So like I kind of miss that. I know even among observers, I know that's like somewhat controversial, but like I really liked doing that. So even remote observing, like which was coming into fashion toward the end of my astronomy research career, I was still like, it's not really observing. You're not driving to the middle of nowhere or flying to the middle of nowhere for a week. But yeah, so I kind of miss that. But
You might like getting involved in occultation astronomy events. We did one of those when I was in grad school. Well, we tried to do more than one, but we successfully participated in one of those. And that's something I would still be open to doing. It's just always raining in Seattle. So this isn't the best place. But yeah, I do miss working on like the type of research that I choose. And then also like going to conferences, and data science conferences do exist. I haven't been to one yet, but yeah, there are plenty of those things. I think there's a trade-off. I know that my research, it does leave some impact, but it's on very few people on Earth. It impacts our knowledge of things in the universe, but it doesn't necessarily change that many lives. And so one of the things I wanted to do in industry was work on some project that actually impacted people's lives more. And so my current company, this is my first job out of academia. So PACCAR, they build Kenworth and Peterbilt trucks. And one thing I've come to realize is that 99 to 100% of the things you have in your room right now were on a truck at some point in their existence. And so even though I play a small role in that whole process, it's still something that affects everybody. And that motivates me.
Yeah, I sympathize with that a lot. I felt a lot of that, honestly. And there was a community of people working on what I worked on, but nothing outside of that. The impact of it for most of astronomy would not have been felt outside of that community of people. And, at least now I'm doing things that we're trying to make a difference in people's lives and for example, their social media use. Yeah, so I agree completely. It's a big world, right? And it needs a lot of data scientists, and it needs a lot of data science done by people who take responsibility, care about the impact of what they're trying to do. And I would like to say thank you to both of you for what you're doing with ATDS. I think it's really having an impact on people who think about leaving astronomy, like they have a clear-cut place to go and ask people questions. And I think it's great. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Betsy. Thanks for joining us on our podcast. And yeah, we are looking forward to growing the community and welcoming new people. I know so far we've mostly had people who have been in the ATDS community for a number of years, but we do want to branch out too, and soon have some people on who have recently made the transition, just to get diverse perspectives. It's exciting talking to people, and it always helps like rejuvenate my desire to continue working in this career.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Astronomers Turned Data Scientists podcast. Please subscribe so you can find out when we release future episodes.